right. Can everybody hear me okay? More or less? All right. Well, welcome. My name is Matt. I think second or third time I've come out here maybe. What I'm providing you guys today is just sort of an update on where we are with some of the work we're doing specific to firefighter health and safety, talk a little bit about some of the issues we see emerging, and then end with a little bit of a discussion on some new education opportunities and programs that the state is now offering. Aside from my role at the university, I do a lot of other stuff outside, including some consulting and other research type support, but also serve as last year's mayor and now back on city council for the city of Temecula, and then sort of interestingly served as the chairman of the board for the Bureau of Cannabis Control for the state of California, right? So you never know where life takes you, but I bring up the cannabis one only because I thought fire research and cannabis, thought that would make a pretty cool logo for a business card, but I never got around to it, so maybe next time. But I do, the reason I also bring up the city of Temecula is because, we're a contract city with CAL FIRE. But I deeply understand not just the risk that a community faces, but also understand the whole contract issue, understand staffing, understand the costs of what it is to run a city and have a good fire department. It was mentioned earlier, we've done some work on staffing studies. We're one of the few cities in the state that actually mandates 4-person engines, citywide. Part of the reason is, I couldn't be a hypocrite. We did the studies, we looked at staffing, and we realized that, a better model over a 3-person engine is a 4-person, not just because there's more bodies, but it has to do with initial attack and especially response on the multitude of different types of responses that agencies, fire agencies for cities have, not just on the wildland. And so I deeply understand all of that, and it's nice to see at least, at a local government level, some of what we do on the research side making its way into local politics. Wanted to start also by talking a little bit about the history here and giving you some deeper perspective. Everybody recognizes this guy, hopefully, Pulaski, Ed Pulaski, Forest Service guy by about 1911, designed the tool that is still used today that bears his name. And the reason I talk about Ed Pulaski is because we use this as sort of a talking point for a symposium that we held in Sacramento now about 5 years ago, talking about wildland fire. And we did it in the context of what the world was looking like in, sort of the early 1900s. If you were to take somebody from the military, in the early 1900s, say 1910 or so, and drop them on a battlefield today, it would be pretty unrecognizable. The technology, the tools, the gear, everything that's out there today is vastly different. I mean, they're mostly using horses back then, for God's sakes, right? But if you were to take a firefighter from 1910 and drop them on a wildland fire today, it would be immediately recognizable. I mean, you're not wearing jeans and a t-shirt anymore, but a lot of the tools are the same, and a lot of, the basic work has remained largely the same. And the reason we talk about that is because when we had the symposium in Sacramento, and we'll be redoing it again this fall, specific to sort of the national perspective on wildland fire, one of the themes that came out of that is that wildland firefighting, and in particular the wildland-urban interface as it's emerged, is easily a generation behind that of structure and high-rise, right? We've spent a lot of money and a lot of resources advancing those fields, and I'll give you some data to help sort of support that perspective if you're interested. But for those of you who work it, I think you understand that, in a lot of respects, there's a tremendous tradition, within the fire agencies that in some cases is unencumbered by progress. And so how do we get past those hurdles? Now, certainly there are new tools and technologies and things out there that have definitely helped, but we haven't had either the state or national investment in this at the levels that we should, and that's been something that's sort of dominated, especially this year's legislature in Sacramento, dominated the conversation as, we have to do better than what we're doing today. And to also put it into a little bit of perspective here too, if you go back into the late 1960s, early 1970s, some amazing things were going on. 1969, one of the biggest events was what?
I was born.
Well, you were born. All right. Well, congratulations. We now know how old you are, so we won't be ashamed to ask. Yeah, Woodstock. No, sorry, Woodstock. Not. I mean, yeah, cool concert, man. But no. I mean, we landed a person on the moon, right? And you still hear that mantra today. If you can land a person on the moon, why can't we do this, right? And that carried through into the early 1970s. By the 1970s, we had, the air quality in Los Angeles was so bad you couldn't see across the street. The symbol of this country, the bald eagle, was going extinct, right? Rivers were literally catching on fire. And then by the mid-1970s, we discovered one of the worst hazardous material sites today, still one of the most hazardous material sites at Love Canal outside of Niagara, right? And what did we do? We passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, a suite of waste laws and other to help deal with that. And so now, for better or worse, you can see across the street in Los Angeles. Anybody from LA? All right, sorry. I love LA, but I like visiting. So, you can see across the street in Los Angeles, we haven't had a river catch on fire like the Cuyahoga again. The bald eagle is now off the endangered species list. We've made some significant progress, right? Again, at that same time, kind of an interesting side note, we don't often associate the Republican Party, just to get into the politics of it, we don't often associate the Republican Party today with an environmental organization, right? And yet all of those laws that we have on the books today were signed off on by Richard Nixon and passed, in some cases, nearly unanimously by a Republican-dominated Congress, right? So see how far we've come. That same year, Nixon had asked for some work on fire, and specifically, some of the things that he was saying on the urban side and structure, where a single house or a business would catch on fire, you need to lose, a city block or more. The injuries and deaths were pretty significant. So in 1973, they commissioned a blue ribbon panel, and a report is published called America's Burning. If you haven't had a chance to look at this, do, because it's still relevant today. And a lot of what we have today on the books as far as code and everything else is based on this earliest of work. By 1974, we passed the Fire Prevention and Control Act, and a lot of the agencies and the regulations, NFPA, a lot of this stuff has emerged to really take the forefront of at least the urban side of firefighting. And as a result, if you compare 1970s to about today, with the data that we had available to us, you look at number of deaths nationwide decreased by nearly 70%. Property loss decreased, and these are adjusted dollars across the country from, this is just urban fire, not wildland, okay, but decreased by nearly half. The total numbers of structures that are burned and completely lost has decreased, and the total numbers of fires as well has decreased by nearly 2/3. Numbers of injuries, and again, didn't keep the kind of data that we do with NFIRS and other things today. Don't keep the same kind of data that we did in the 1970s, but best estimates say it's about a 75% decrease. And to, again, put this into a broader context, more importantly, all of this occurred while at the same time the US population increased by 35%, right? So that is a remarkable success story, and I think we need to treat it as such. Now, if you go back to some of the metrics on wildland fire, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with this, I hate the word fire season or the term fire season. We need to just call it fire year, because fire season for a lot of folks, including our decision makers and legislature, denotes a specific time of year when things are bad, and outside of that we can downstaff or sort of minimize our resources and our investment in it, not recognizing that some of the worst fires in California history, especially the last 20 years, have actually happened during the winter, right? So we need to get away from that. But if we use the term fire season, the estimates are that the number of days of high risk have increased by nearly 50%. Fires of over 1,000 acres have increased by 100%. Fires of over 10,000 acres have increased by 250%. We've gone from 3 million to roughly 8 million acres burned every year across the nation, right? And so that, to me, says the opposite of what happened on the urban and structure side, and we definitely need to do better. That 8 million mark, just to put it in context, is kind of a nebulous number. That is roughly the size of the state of, it's a geography lesson, come on guys. No, Maryland, all right. So nobody's obviously from back east, so this one's gonna stump you as well because it's also the size of 5 states of Delaware. Oh, who got that one? All right, nobody ever gets Delaware. But then to put it into a local context, because I'm from the city of Temecula, it means that a city the size of Temecula, we would lose roughly 250 of those every year, right? So that's a pretty big number when you put it into those sorts of contexts. 95% of the fires, both in the state of California and nationally, are human-caused, not natural events. 1 in 6 now damages transportation or infrastructure, and 1 in 10 destroys homes with an average of about 3,000, and that number is going up in recent years, but an average of about 3,000 homes lost per year over the last 20 years or so. And this isn't just a West Coast issue, right? It isn't just a California problem, and it isn't just something that happens west of the Mississippi. Connecticut actually has more wildland urban interface per capita than any other state. Sort of an interesting factoid that you can share with your friends from Connecticut, I suppose. Also, 47.3% of all statistics are just basically made up on the spot. So, all right, good, you're all awake. We have nationwide over 250,000 square miles of high-risk area that have been identified. About 45 million homes. Some estimates go as high as 75 million homes. California does win as far as the total number of homes by any state that exist in a high-risk area. We have 5.1 million, and that number is increasing. And depending on which specific plan, general plan, master plan you look at, for cities and counties statewide, we've only built about 35% roughly of the available area that we can put homes in these high-risk areas, right? So there's a lot more that we can do that places communities and first responders at risk. So going back to Ed Pulaski and all of that, that's kind of the perspective that I come from, and a lot of the folks I come from, saying, how do we advance this, and recognize that wildland fire in the most traditional sense isn't the way it used to be in the 1970s or turn of the century. It's vastly different, and that's because it's been creeping into our backyards, right? And we've created this interface zone where a lot of stuff happens, and we simply just don't understand it very well. And there's a significant risk placed on not just our communities, but the folks who are responding to these incidents. And it's the novelty of what's being burned in these areas that we've never had to deal with. And it changes on a regular basis, right? If you look at the products that are in our homes or in our buildings today, or even if just look at your own garage, the stuff that's in there is pretty nasty when it combusts. The challenge with that is, I just taught a course on combustion physics, right? Super boring class. But the bottom line is, what I kept telling folks is you have things like, ideal gas laws and other things on which we base a lot of our understanding of the physics and the chemistry of combustion. But the reality is those are based on these sort of idealized laboratory type settings, and we really don't understand what happens in the combustion process. And in fact, when you start adding in all these varieties of different materials into that process, we're no longer dealing with just a heavy timber fire, grassland, or chaparral. We're dealing with all this other stuff in that atmospheric cocktail, and we simply don't understand that intermix or what it does. And we also need to recognize that the firefighters who are responding and the folks who are working in this don't have the right kind of protection that they likely need, right? Interestingly, we went through a lot of studies looking at sort of the last 50 years or so of research on smoke exposure. And it broke it into basically 3 categories: vehicle, structure, and wildland fire. And very few studies dealt with all 3 of these things occurring at the same time. And most studies that looked at exposure risk assumed that if a structure were burning, that the first responders, the firefighters going to that, would be wearing an SCBA or the right kind of gear to protect themselves. The question we had was a very simple one. What happens when you're 200 feet away from that structure or that vehicle and you're in that inversion for 24 hours? You know, what are you breathing? And how does that variability change over time? And what are the risks associated with that? And especially when, you know, all you basically have is a bandana to throw over your face, mostly to protect you from heat. And let's be honest, you know, the kind of respiratory protection you get from that, you know, simply just doesn't do its job. So, you know, what are the risks that we're facing? And recognize, too, that a lot of the names that we put on our memorials now for firefighters are not always line-of-duty deaths. A lot of those are cancer-related today. So, you know, there's a lot of novelty, a lot of things we don't understand in the types of products and materials and things that we're being exposed to today. And so, going back to the 1970s and America's burning, one of the things that made that move forward as quickly as it did was research and education. That was a big part of the recommendations. They said we simply have to do better, and we can't make good decisions and set new policy and create new code if we don't understand what the problems actually are. You know, so the first couple of decades from the 1970s and the 1980s, tremendous amount of funding and support for research and education programs, right? And so that's really been a big part of the conversation. And again, going back to some of this, we, you know, not just need to educate ourselves and understand the process better, but we also need to educate the decision makers. And it starts with really simple things. Like I said, you know, fire season, no, we need to start using terms like fire year. And when we're talking about wildland fire, we need to start talking about WUI fire. So firefighter exposure research, right? These are the things that we're working on right now. Let's start with heart rates. Heart rates and cardiac issues are among some of the biggest issues that we're dealing with today. We did a study, hooked up about 100 firefighters to a variety of sensors and watched them do their job. Now, I will say that most important in this is that we never had the folks at the head of the fire at initial attack or the folks that are, you know, dropped in and you know, do the heaviest amount of work. Partly because our agreement with both the Forest Service and CAL FIRE is we cannot have an operational impact, which means, you know, on initial attack, we can't hold up folks and say, okay, I'd like you to swallow this core temperature pill, and I need to put this chest strap on you, and I need to put this, you know, skin temperature probe, you know, we just can't do that, right? And so we didn't get the worst of the worst, but what we did get was pretty scary. 2/3 of the firefighters we worked with had sustained peak heart rates above 200 beats a minute, and roughly 1/5 of those carried above 220. Now, if you know what the Heart Association recommends, it's 220 minus your age, right? That's your peak heart rate. But also, your operating peak heart rate is actually 85% of that number. So what we found out is 95% of the firefighters actually exceeded their recommended max heart rate. And roughly, I would say, on average, they were operating at about 125% of where they should have been, right? That's kind of a big deal. We used a lot of the same sensors that the NFL were using at the time and the folks at North Island for Navy SEAL training base. It was kind of newer technology at the time, and we all had questions about its ability to do what we needed to and reliability in the field. And so there were a bunch of us that actually got together one afternoon, and we're sitting at North Island, and we're showing, you know, some of the data and all that. And just to put it into perspective again, folks from Navy SEALs looked at our data, and they said, we would never let our folks do that, right? That's how serious that is. And in fact, the NFL looked at it and said, yeah, we sit our guys down and put them under those cooling tents and push water on them immediately, right? It just simply, we do not let people get into that, you know, high risk of a situation, which explains why 48% of all on-duty firefighter fatalities have to do with sudden cardiac death, right? It helps explain, you know, that 0 to 60 that you guys are running. It's tough. I will tell you one of the reasons why I got really interested in all this a few years back is we mentioned that staffing study. There was a point in time where we were doing staffing study looking at attack effectiveness and just sort of out of curiosity hooked the firefighters up with heart rate monitors to see how they were doing. And what we found out was, you know, going from a 3-person to a 4-person engine not only extended a 2,000-foot hose line 50% faster, but it also significantly dropped everyone's heart rate because you're sharing the workload. And that's something, you know, that we need to take into consideration, because it's not just about, you know, when we talk about mitigation, when you share that workload and you lower your heart rate, you're also lowering your exposure. You're not breathing as much. You're not breathing in as much of that bad stuff. And so while we may not have a good, you know, in-field respirator to deal with some of the stuff that's out there right now, we certainly can use, you know, staffing as a mitigation measure out in the field. Of course, now you have the, you know, conversation of cost-benefit analysis that you have to describe to all of these, you know, departments and agencies and decision makers about, you know, investing that, you know, extra dollar to provide the kind of staffing you need to offset, you know, some of the more serious impacts. But moving on, we're also working right now, and actually we're going up to Clark later this week to test out some new stuff related to hydration. Of that initial study that we did, we realized that hydration is kind of a big deal. You know, I've got some folks in the audience I think we spoke to last year. It's good to see you again. You know, hey, hydration's a big deal. We recognize that. U.S. Forest Service is working with us, among others, to address that. And there's a couple of things that we've recognized. One is ad libitum drinking is probably just fine, which means you know when you're thirsty, right? You don't necessarily have to create a SOP or a protocol to get folks to drink water. And in fact, there's tons of studies that suggest exactly that. The problem is especially on an active wildland or WUI fire, you don't often have the time to say, hang on, I gotta take a sip, it's getting a little hot, right? It's just not there. And so it's not the same sort of context that a lot of these other hydration studies were, where, you know, you've got an active incident and you're not thinking about the fact that you're getting dehydrated. Other issues associated with that, you know, heat stress and heat-related injuries, you know, dehydration, and even carbon monoxide exposure, they all have very similar symptoms, you know. So, you know, you don't want to misdiagnose any of those in the field. And you want to eliminate as much of that, you know, uncertainty as possible. And keeping folks hydrated certainly is an issue. What we did find out, though, is folks who started off when we saw them in the morning and we did the urinalysis on them, we found out that folks who start off dehydrated tend to stay dehydrated for the rest of the day and in most cases get worse, right? Those who started off hydrated tended to do better throughout the day. Now, there was a subset of folks who started off dehydrated that self-corrected during the day. They got enough fluids in them and they were able to, you know, get back on track. But it's certainly a consideration. And what surprised us, I think, the most was the number of folks who would start off in the morning at or near a level of dehydration. You know, it's just simply not a great way to start off the morning. And we're all tired. We all, you know, understand how difficult it is, especially if you've been on duty for, you know, multiple days. But that is a very important piece of this. One of the things we're working on this year is looking at whether hydration can be used as mitigation for respiratory and cardiac, because what we did notice when we looked at some of the data more closely is that, you know, at periods of time we would see folks' heart rate drop dramatically, right? And we tried to associate it with something and we weren't able to. And so the assumption was, after we started thinking about it a little bit longer, was those were periods of time where they took a moment to drink some fluids, and just putting that amount of, you know, cooler fluid, even if it's, you know, 70, 80 degrees, it's still cooler than 103, right? And so just putting that into your body works as a bit of a heat sink and helps, you know, reduce your core temperature, which in turn helps, you know, reduce, because core temperature and heart rate track each other very closely. And so what we're trying to do this year is look at not just, you know, drinking as sort of a tool for mitigation, but whether the temperature of that fluid, so if you're giving, you know, 5 degree or so, you know, cold water to folks, does that do even more? Does it have a greater benefit than just sort of, you know, ambient temperature water? You know, not surprisingly, I'm sure the answers and, you know, the folks in the back, you're going to say, yeah, of course it does, right? Of course it does. But again, when you pose this to the decision makers and the folks who have to say, you know, how do we get cold water out to, you know, folks in the field, and how do we, you know, just logistically, again, it goes back to a cost-benefit analysis of, you know, what works and what doesn't, and how do you make all of this, you know, fit together. Going back to the exposure piece, you know, I mentioned that, you know, we started asking questions a few years back about, you know, what kind of exposures folks have in the field, what they're breathing in, And really, it just came from me standing out there with all the rest of you. My eyes are burning. I'm having difficulty breathing. Chief Curtis Brown, if you guys know him up in CAL FIRE, he tells me at one of these incidents, if you hear a tree falling, get out of the way. I'm like, no kidding. But I can't see anything, so I'm hoping to God you either, throw yourself on top of me or push me out of the way. But, as we're standing there, I'm thinking, what is it that we're breathing in right now, right? Because I see a vehicle, 400 feet away. It's on fire. I see a house that's on fire just a little bit away. Fences made out of, vinyl, all sorts of stuff. I'm like, this isn't just a heavy timber fire. There's a lot going on right now, and what are we breathing? And like I said, we went through all these studies, and we found out that we don't know the answer. And like I said also, most studies tended to put it into its category of structure or wildland, assuming vegetation or non-vegetation, right? But what we have today are WUI fires, so what do we get when we combine all of that stuff together? And what we found out were a lot of interesting things. We worked with NIST and a few other laboratories nationally, and we collected vegetation from all over the place. We did it in California, did some heavy timber, did some sage, some chaparral and some grass, went out to Texas, did some palmetto down in Florida, did some timber up in Colorado as well. And we sent all this stuff out to these laboratories to test the vegetation. One of the interesting things we found was chaparral tended to have much higher levels of some of the more dangerous substances than others, right? Chaparral is a pretty complex suite of different types of plants and vegetation. They have a lot of oils and things in there, not that timber doesn't, but it tends to burn pretty dirty. And in fact, the levels of cyanide, which is a byproduct of that sort of incomplete combustion, levels of cyanide were much higher in chaparral than any of the other vegetation types we sent in. And again, not surprising if you remember your physics and chemistry of fire, grasses tended to be the healthiest, if you will, of stuff to burn, outside of the new kind of grass that we're growing in California. So there you go. There's your plug for cannabis. So what we're looking at today are a suite of different factors. The particulates, obviously, but looking at carbon monoxide. The pause here, I have it listed twice. I don't know why, I just noticed that, because it's just that important. I'll talk about those in a moment, but those are the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, your NOx, your SOx, cyanides, sulfuric, or any types of variety of airborne acids, benzene, your volatile organics, all of that stuff. And there are a variety of sensors that'll help you understand. And so we try to basically go out and, like I say, understand not just in isolation what these things are doing, but what they're doing collectively, and get past a lot of the historic research that doesn't really answer the kinds of questions that we have. We're doing it on actual WUI incidents, the more traditional wildland where you've got mostly just vegetation burning, and then on controlled burns and some additional laboratory testing as well. I'll give you an example just from carbon monoxide's perspective. One of the things we've seen is that on a regular basis, you have exposures above 400 parts per million. If we want to talk, is OSHA in the room? All right. If you want to talk about this, I'll say occupational exposure limits across the board are exceeded, right? It just depends on what the peaks look like and how often that occurs. We were at a meeting not too long ago done with our partners with FEMA and Homeland Security, and we asked the very simple question of among some of the expert doctors, right? I'm not a medical doctor, just so you know, I'm the other kind of doctor that doesn't actually help people. It's true. I'll only say this because I was at the city of Temecula. We do a reading thing with our elementary schools, right? And you laughed the most, sir, so I'll pick you out. But we did a reading thing, and the kids, it's for Dr. Seuss National Reading Day and all that, and I'm reading a book to these kids. And they ask you a bunch of questions, and I was mayor last year, so they had a bunch of questions about that, and then somebody said, oh, you're a doctor, and I tried to explain to them the difference between a medical doctor and what I do, and this little girl in the front row, she's like, oh, I get it, you're the kind of doctor that doesn't help people, and funny enough, I was like, yeah, okay, it's about right. So anyway, But aside from that, peak exposures, I mean, we're seeing things in, 1,200, even 2,400, or 2,800 max in some cases. The problem is when we were talking to these experts in, sort of occupational exposure and carbon monoxide, I asked them what I thought was a very simple question, and I hadn't seen much in the literature on. And I said, just from a carbon monoxide perspective, what's worse? Really high levels for a short period of time, or low levels for a longer period of time? And they all looked at each other and said, I don't know. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of too bad, right? I mean, haven't we been doing this kind of, I mean, when I say that Wildland and all of this is, behind, it truly is. Because from, traditional occupational exposure, most of the time they focused on sort of low-level stuff, right? But they've never really asked those kind of questions because the typical person isn't trying to expose themselves to carbon monoxide on a regular basis at either high or low levels for different durations of time, right? It's just not something I'm like, well, you guys need to start thinking about this. You're the smarter ones. This is a good question for you guys to try and figure out. We do this both, like I say, in the laboratory, in the field, and even at test burns where we get a lot of novel products and we put them in these chambers and we combust them. Then we put the sensors at various distances from that combustion to see what's happening. Kind of like when I said I'm standing 400 feet away from a building. What am I breathing in? There's something there that's made its way over here. What is that stuff? I just wanted to say this is Chief Brown out of Sacramento. He actually does work every so often for those, him. We caught him. We got a picture of it. But one of the things that we also figured out was that much like in structure fire, wildland fire emits a tremendous amount of byproduct during that phase of mop-up, right? And they figured that out on the structure side, right? They tell folks now, don't take your SCBAs off during mop-up because that's when the highest levels of carbon monoxide are out there and some of the highest levels of cyanide gases and other things. Well, same thing is true for, I don't know why folks aren't talking about it, but the same thing is true on the wildland side. When you're just walking around and the ground is just kind of smoky and things are doing what they're doing, that's when you have the most amount of incomplete combustion and a lot of these variety of byproducts occurring. And so we try and get into the incidents, we try and understand what it is. The biggest problem we're running into is the sensors themselves. The first year we started doing this, we would have the sensors max out on what they were reading. And so I'm on the phone with these companies saying, I need something that can read higher levels of, sulfur or VOCs or whatever. And the company's on the phone with me saying, well, you shouldn't be there if the levels are that high, right? I was like, okay, granted, but let's pretend we are. I need something that can do better. And in some cases, our technology just doesn't fit with the kinds of questions we have. The other thing, though, is the variability. There's a number of studies that sort of, and I think personally, sort of underestimate the actual exposure. And I think it's a limitation of the sensor technology itself, whether it's an optical sensor or direct reading. What ends up happening is, occasionally, and you've all probably been on an incident, the wind blows, right? And the wind isn't blowing fresh air necessarily, but it's blowing something, and in many cases, it's cleaner than what's sitting there in the heavier smoke. But what we saw on a lot of the sensors is when that gust of wind would come through, the sensors would often get sort of wiped, I would call it, and go back down to zero, right? And so our readings would say the air is clean. And in fact, we know it's not. We're standing in there. I mean, where's this clean air coming from? We're in an inversion right now. So we shouldn't be reading zero, right? So we've been working with NIST in the laboratory and in others doing these combustion tests, and they've got way better technology and stuff. They've got whole rooms where they can build structures and burn stuff, and so I love working with them because you get to play in their laboratory for a week or so. What we've done is we've encapsulated or enclosed all of the sensors inside of these canisters to basically mimic the exposure, right? So it helps create a stable air environment around the sensor so it doesn't get that wind blowing or that turbulence that messes with the sensor's reading. And so we'll be testing that this year. And it'll be really interesting because it's the first time that's been done in the field. And it may suggest that a lot of the studies that have been done on wildland fire where they say, oh, carbon monoxide and cyanide gas and all that, it's really not that big of a deal. It may actually be a big deal. It just may be that there's a limitation of the capability of what these sensors can do. I told you I'd get back to polycyclics. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are pretty nasty things. There's 18, I think, known that basically are related to cancer, right? They are organic molecules. They're carbon rings, if you will, and depending on what's being combusted, these things will form. And they're all able to be absorbed by your skin or breathed in, right? Very small, relatively molecule size. And they're particularly created when you have incomplete combustion, which is often a big part of wildland and WUI fires. What folks have been saying for a bunch of years is PA exposure in wildland and WUI incidents is pretty high. How high? Well, we're just starting to understand that. And so there's been a lot of great research done on sort of the respiratory risk that these molecules pose to firefighters and others. But there have been a number of studies, and mostly again on the structure side, not on the wildland side, but on the structure side related to skin exposure. And you've probably seen a lot of that, right? Where you bag your turnouts now, and there's some departments are pushing things like cold showers post exposure and so forth, right? And they looked at how you're moving some of these substances from the fire incident itself into the cab of the the engine or whatever. I mean, all of you've probably heard about all of this, and as a result, a lot of protocols for exposure related to structure fires has changed over the years. That isn't the case for wildland. And do we have any folks from the Forest Service in the room? Where are you guys? Yeah, you're like about the worst. I mean, you are the dirtiest folks I've ever seen out in the field. God love you, but I mean, you just don't change your PPE. I don't know. I don't get it. Not to say that the rest of you guys are necessarily clean, because you're not. But Forest Service in particular, you can always pick them out. You just from a distance, like, oh, there's the Forest Service. There's a hot shot. But it's not a great thing, because you look at that gear and you look at the exposures, and again, just a couple of years ago, I was asking myself, if they've done this with the structure side, why aren't we doing it on the wildland, or in particular the WUI? Because certainly the same types of exposures are occurring. Now, most of the studies that are done are wipe studies, right? So you use an alcohol swab or you use a cotton swab, and sometimes they'll put something in there to help pick up, like corn oil they used in one study done by NIOSH. But basically you swab a surface of the PPE in different locations, and then often the skin as well, and you try and pick up what is on that person or on their gear. And then you run it in different types of laboratory equipment, gas chromatographs and the like, and you try and extract from that swab sample what it is that was being exposed. Well, we got a grant from FEMA and DHS to do just that. And I'll tell you, last year wasn't, I hate to characterize it as a failure, because it wasn't, but last year was very disinteresting, right? We did all the same protocols. We used what CDC did. We used what NIOSH did. We kind of combined all of these protocols, said we want to make it as comparable as possible to other swab studies with PPE and skin, and we didn't find out a whole lot of stuff that's interesting. In fact, there was one sample in particular where we saw person with the drip torch had actually spilled some diesel on their pants, and that happened to be in one of the locations that we swab on the thigh. We're like, well, that'll be an interesting one. So we made note of that. We sent it into the laboratory, and it doesn't really spike with much of anything of interest. And so I said, well, that's weird, because we saw her spill the diesel on her front of her pants earlier in the day. Should have had some residual something going on. What are we missing here? And what I think what we found out is, again, it's the short-term versus long-term exposure. You put somebody in some turnouts, you put them into a structure fire, it's going to be high exposure level, but for a short period of time, relatively speaking, right? And it's in an enclosed space as well. So you're going to have a lot of stuff on the surface. Wildland, however, not necessarily the case, because you're going to be out there for an 8, 12, 24-hour, and that exposure is going to be periodic. And if you don't do a swipe of that sample, like if we had done, okay, so she spilled the diesel on the front of her pants, we're going to come back 5 minutes later and do the swab and send that into the laboratory. we probably would have gotten something interesting. But in fact, we didn't do it that way. We waited till the end of the shift, just like they did with the structure folks. And we realized we're missing something because most likely the stuff that they're being exposed to is now not on the surface of the PPE, but more or less embedded in the PPE itself. And the same is probably true for the skin. By the time you get around to doing a skin sample, yeah, there's going to be some interesting stuff, especially the heavy metals. You know, they will tend to be more on the skin. But as far as the polycyclics and the stuff we're really concerned with, by the time we got around to actually swabbing, we probably missed those peak exposure times. And don't forget, especially the polycyclics, those are, you know, in most cases fairly volatile. And so, you know, two of the things that help degrade PAWs quickly are light and heat, which on most incidents you're going to be exposed to light and heat. And so what we decided to do was get away from the traditional wipe sampling and instead actually attach pieces of, you know, the PPE on top of the PPE and then send that entire sample into the laboratory for testing, right? Because if the assumption is that it's being embedded into this material, then we need to be able to test the entire material, not just a swab of the surface. And so we did some initial testing on this. Turns out we're probably right. But we'll find out once we get onto some actual incidents this year, and we'll be starting this week and next on some controlled burns and others. But if that's the case, it says two things. One is that for all of the structure studies that have been done so far on PPE, they were probably done right, but they probably also missed quite a bit of what the exposure is because they'll still have stuff embedded in the material that they didn't send into the laboratory, right? So that embedding issue, how you get around that, you know, that's a challenge. But the other one is it explains why when Forest Service did a fairly similar study over the last couple of years trying to set standards with NFPA as well, Forest Service was struggling with it because they couldn't get any reliable data from their studies either. And so we're trying out this new protocol, and I think we're actually onto something here. But it also means that, you know, if that's the case, then we may have actually, on all of these past studies on PPE, and especially the structure, it may have actually underrepresented, you know, the exposure risk that folks are experiencing. So other things, you know, I'll be working with the new chief for CAL FIRE this year. He's a good guy. He's, you know, got a slightly different perspective than Chief Pimlott, but you know, one of the things I think desperately needs to start occurring within Wildland and especially the WUI fires and especially what we've seen off of Paradise and Thomas and other, you know, major incidents over the last several years. You know, after 9/11, there was a lot of study done on first responders for exposure and long-term health. And you do these longitudinal studies with folks, and they're going to be doing them for 20, 30 years, tracking these folks and their exposure and their risk. Paradise Fire, Thomas Fire, you know, these levels of incidents, those are 9/11 scale exposures, right? And in some cases might actually be worse because, you know, as we're out there interviewing folks and collecting, you know, basic data, how many days you've been out on the fire, and you'll have somebody, oh, this is my 42nd day. Wow, right? Now I get that's not 42 days in you know, sequence, but still. So you're telling me that, you know, you're in this, and then, you know, what I'm also seeing is on some of these incidents too, and you all know this, when you go back to base camp or when you go back to, you know, the hotel or wherever you're staying, you're often not taking yourself completely out of that inversion and that risk. And especially this last year, there really wasn't a place you could go to get out of that exposure and that risk. You know, and so what I don't understand is why, you know, we're not taking this a lot more seriously and starting to do those longitudinal studies on those firefighters, because again, these exposures are unlike anything we've ever seen before and include substances that we simply do not understand. And so we need to have a dedication not just to collecting the data, but actually doing a follow-through and doing this for many, many years. And in fact, I'd take it even a step further and say one of the things we definitely need to focus on is starting to collect that data from day one when somebody steps onto the job, right? And tracking them over their career. Because, you know, and of course, look, once we find stuff out, we're gonna have to figure out how to do something with it, right? But we could be here 30 years from now, and I could be giving the same talk I'd have a few more gray hairs and you know, that kind of thing. But you know, we could all be sitting here saying, geez, I wonder what's going on some of these incidents and what the long-term health implications are for firefighters, or we could have some better understanding of it. I'd prefer that we have a better understanding of it, and we need to get more aggressive about that in our conversations with, you know, the decision makers and the folks who fund this kind of stuff. And there's some good examples to look at. Like I said, 9/11, post 9/11, some excellent work came out of that and really helped set a benchmark for how these studies are done. If you go to Fort McMurray out of Canada a few years back, same thing. They did a similar exposure study for their folks that were left behind that fought those fires, and it was extreme exposure that they had. So we need to try and figure out how to make that happen, you know, at least in California, and hopefully with our state, local, and federal, and even, you know, other partners, tribal and others. Okay, so that's sort of the good news, bad news of where we are in terms of research, and wanted to sort of segue here into education. So like I said, 5 years ago or so, we held a symposium up in Sacramento. It was led by CAL FIRE and others, brought experts from around the country. And it was basically doing what they had hoped that Blue Ribbon Commission would have done under the Obama administration, but answered a lot of questions. And again, the focus was also on research and education. We're continuing to do that, but the state of California, and especially the CSU system, programs I work with, we recognize the value of education. And so just this year, we've launched a new Bachelor of Science degree in Wildfire in the Urban Interface. It's first of its kind in the country. It was done in partnership with a lot of agencies. The big ones, of course, CAL FIRE, San Diego County, LA County, 2881, Forest Service. We worked with a variety of community colleges, the IAFF, NIST, you know, just a variety. And then other odd ones over the, you know, 3 years it was in development. We'd have folks out of Texas and Florida. We even had Boston Fire come and talk with us at one point. And so we tried to step it up and work with the agencies first, and then, you know, sort of bring that back to the university to have it match up as closely as possible. It is what we call a 2+2 completion. So if you've got an associate's degree, you're basically done with the first 2 years, right? We don't need you to go in and waste a lot of time with additional classes. The only caveat to that is what we call the Golden Four. The Golden Four are, you know, oral communications, mathematics, written, and I don't know, something else that we think is important. Sorry. God, right? This is why I don't teach the first 2 years. Anyway, but we work with local colleges and others, so you can go to any of your colleges and pick up those classes, no problem. But it's designed as a fully online program. It's for working professionals. There's a guarantee to get done in 2 years, or, you know, at the pace that you need to get it done at. The idea really was that you create that next generation of wildland urban interface firefighters, right? Provide them the tools and the understanding that they need. But as we started developing this program, things emerged in the curricula that were surprises to me and a lot of others. You know, you'll see all the typical stuff, the physics, the chemistry, the ecology, policy, you know, land use and development, cultural resources. A lot of stuff got thrown into the mix, and so we're trying to address all of that. But some of the more interesting ones was firefighter mental and behavioral health. You know, it's become an important topic in the fire agencies today, and we're designing a course with the Center of Excellence for the IAFF in mental and behavioral health and experts in the field to actually teach that course, right? And one thing I should mention too is these courses aren't exclusive to folks that are enrolled in our program and get admitted. They're also, anybody can sign up for them if they want to. The other thing that's interesting about this is this whole program is done through what's called extended learning. It's not through a traditional biology department or something like that. And what that allows me to do is actually hire the actual experts to teach the class, right? Universities say you have to have a master's degree or PhD to teach at a university. Well, in most cases, I would argue that some of the foremost experts in the country aren't the ones with the PhDs. You know, they're the folks who've been doing this for 20, 30 years of their career. And I would much rather have them help us with the curricula and teach those courses than somebody who's never actually, you know, lived it and done it. And so our goal is to make this as relevant as possible, but also as adaptive as possible for the agencies, because as we start to learn more things, I'm teaching a course this semester called Emerging Topics and Technologies, right? And so we've picked a variety. Some of them are related to PPE, others are related to drone technology, right? You know, it has to be adaptive to all the other stuff that's happening out there and as things start to change. So with that, I'm going to end there. That's our website if you're interested. That's my email and phone number if you're interested. And I think we might have a couple of minutes for questions. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your week here. Yes, sir.
I've been doing safety for quite a while. I've worked on crews, hot truck crews for a number of years. And I got two real big pet peeves with the PPE stuff. One is modified PPE.
Yeah.
You see a lot of people that are modifying their britches and modifying their shirts and all that kind of stuff. I've actually pulled crews off the line because the only thing yellow about their Nomex was the buttons. And trying to explain what they're doing to their skin.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the best place to go to get that information where I can put it in a one-page summary and hand it to a hotshot superintendent and say, look, here's what I'm talking about. Yeah. This is nothing that's going to have an effect on you today, but after 25 years of being a hotshot, I worry about a lot of things. You know, what I was exposed to, because I was a grimy little dude too.
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. You know, we're trying to pull together all the literature and the research that's been done. But like I say, specifically with Wildland, there's not a whole lot that's been done. You know, there's plenty on the structure side, and I can, you know, shoot me an email and I can send you a lot of that literature. But as far as the Wildland and the WUI, you know, that's what we're struggling with, trying to figure out right now.
Well, and if there is anything that's done on any time in the near future, send it to the Lessons Learned Center.
Sure.
In Tucson, because Travis and the guys there will post that stuff, and it's a place where people will see the numbers of what they're being exposed to and what the, you know, what the cancer agents are. You talk about the carcinogens and all that kind of stuff. I've known about that for years.
Yeah, this isn't rocket science. I mean, that's why I say I'm the kind of doctor that doesn't help people, because, you know, none of this is that complicated, right? And especially at the level that, you know, the research that's needed in the Wildland and the WUI right now, it's really basic stuff. And yet, you know, you get this sort of decision paralysis at various levels of agencies or legislatures because they want information on which to base a good decision. And I get that. Some of it's just common sense, so it should be done anyway. But others, you know, look, if you need the data, okay. But then we got to get the data, right? And so that's the biggest challenge that I think, you know, the Wildland WUI industry as a whole is facing right now. Or one of them. Yes, ma'am.
So earlier you said you did studies on control burns. Were those structure or wildland?
No, these were all wildland. So it was mostly grass and brush and some timber.
When you're doing the wildland studies, no slurry drop or retardant drop is involved in that study. It's just the grass and terrain.
Yeah, and so we'll describe the vegetation that's being burned and all of that, but we don't spend a whole lot of time on the structure side. Yeah, although we've done some of that, you know. So there was a couple of you know, where they'll use, you know, training on a course on a structure, and, you know, you go in and out and they use the pallets and other things to simulate for, you know, all that. We'll do some of that, but it's not as valuable information because it's a lot more variable. And they're typically wearing the SCBAs and all that anyway. So
when you're doing your studies for controlled burns, do you use just ground data or do you use air and satellite and forensic weather or infrared? Do you use any of those?
No, we don't go that far. The resolution isn't good enough to be useful for what we're trying to get. And in fact, our biggest challenge is trying to get a good estimate of what the firefighters themselves are being exposed to, because that's what we're most interested in. But making sure that, you know, the sensors are as close to their working environment as possible, but recognize that, you know, these sensors can't get as hot as people can, and, you know, they're not as durable as they need to be, and so there's a lot of limitations on what we can say. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all so much.